and I'm very excited to moderate this session. And it's titled "The Palestinian Struggle and the Case Against Apartheid Israel." With us is going to be Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, who is from Palestine Land Society, and his topic is the Palestinian Nakba, decolonizing history, reclaiming memory. Dr. Abu Sitta has a long history in Palestinian activism as well as in Palestinian politics. He also wrote one of the most important documented books on Palestine. It's called The Atlas of Palestine, 1917 to 1966. It was published over a decade ago. And I think if anybody is interested to know about the geography, the lands, the history of Palestine, from that perspective, he will find it an excellent resource. He's also the founder and president of the Palestine Land Society, which is in England. Next, we will have after him one of my heroes also, Professor Richard Falk from Princeton University and Queen University in London. And he will be speaking about Israel and the question of apartheid. Dr. Falk has long resume. It's very difficult to read it and not to take from their time. But of course, he is an expert on international law. He was also in charge of the human rights in occupied Palestine for many years, I think 2008 through 2014. It's a position called UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. And of course, he has numerous books and studies on the Middle East and particularly on Palestine. And he will be speaking to us, as I said, about Israel and the question of apartheid. The third speaker is much younger, but is very sharp, and I'm very happy to host him. He is from the Human Rights Watch, is Mr. Omar Shakir, and he's the one actually the main author of the newly published report on the situation in Palestine. And his topic would be Israeli authorities and the crimes of apartheid and persecution. What does the Human Rights Watch report reveal? Each one of our speakers is given about 20 minutes to summarize their remarks. Then we will open it up for questions and answers. Our team is available to forward any questions that you may have to me. So please, if you're watching through YouTube, in the comment section, write your questions or comments, and they will be forwarded to me, and I will ask them when I get them. Now we'll start with Dr. Salman. Please start. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, for this invitation for this conference in which we meet many old friends and make new friends, at least virtually. It is a great effort. We know now that we cannot silence the voice of Palestine anymore. So let me just start by saying one of the sad features of the recent Palestine history is that a young man or woman carries a faded picture of grandparents in their house in Palestine, or a photo of their passport or driving license marked Palestine, or a stamp of Palestine, or a Palestine railway timetable. All this is to prove there were and there is Palestine. We're not talking about Roman history. This is a real history in the life of many people who are still alive today. I am one of them. Obliterating memory is one of the many ways Zionists waged wars against Palestinians. These wars included erasing Palestine's history, geography, and replacing them with a false, invented, or exaggerated mythology. These wars also included political wars, rendering international law redundant by vetoing UN resolutions. They included economic wars by blockade and starvation. They included defamation, misinformation, and witch hunt for those who dared to tell the truth. This is unprecedented in any colonial project. The last 100 years saw the longest war against a people, defenseless people, unaware, unprepared, unsuspecting, Such war is waged against them by the tripartite force of the biggest powers of the modern world: the British Empire, the US superpower, and the multipole power of European Zionism. That the Palestinians survive today is a miracle. True, they are wounded, dispersed, coerced, vilified, relentlessly attacked without a moment of relief. But like the phoenix, they rise from the rubble of Gaza to say, we are still alive, we resist. Their children, 14 years of age, have suffered the vagaries of 5 wars, and constant siege, reducing their food, water, medicine, and movement, and keeping them on a diet, in the words of East European settlers who diagnosed that. Take the recent case of Gaza, still vividly remembered. What happened in Gaza is genocide. There is no other name for it. To bombard 2 million people in the world's biggest concentration camp in a 30 by 12 kilometer strip by air, land, and sea is genocide. Let me tell you why 2 million people are packed in a huge concentration camp in Gaza Strip. Nobody ever told you about that. Of 247 villages who lived in southern Palestine, 50% of Palestine, they were attacked by the Israeli Haganah. They depopulated them and pushed them into Gaza Strip. That is in the remaining 1.3% of Palestine. Those who lived in 50% of Palestine are here. Occupation of these villages, such as Bureir, Beit Daras, Simsim, to mention only a few. That happened before Israel declared itself as a state. The massacres of the refugees did not stop since. For 70 years, those Palestinians were attacked in refugee camps in 1953, 56, 67, 71, and constantly since 2006. How could this come about? This is the story of a 100-year war against a people. As you all know, in 1917, Arthur James Balfour was Britain's foreign minister. He was the anti-Semite. He was the anti-Semite who formulated the Aliens Act in 1905 to prevent European Jews from coming to England. So he planned to ship them out to Palestine, where they can serve as a base for Western interests. Thus, the infamous Balfour Declaration, which referred to 95% Arab population of Palestine as the non-Jewish population. So the creed of settlers' colonialism is that natives do not count, even if they were the absolute majority. In 1936, Palestinians revolted against the flood of settlers to Palestine. This revolt was met with utmost brutal British brutality. The RAF bombed villages indiscriminately. The British killed farmers, destroyed their homes, wounded and imprisoned tens of thousands, disbanded political parties, and deported their leaders. By 1939, the Palestinian society was dismembered, defenseless, and leaderless. The year 1939 can be identified as the British-inflicted Nakba. 10 years later, Ben Gurion carried out the Zionist-inflicted Nakba of 1948. It started with the Zionist invasion of Palestine in the spring of 1948. I say it decidedly, it's the Zionist invasion of Palestine. The settlers from Poland and Russia invaded Palestine with an army of 120,000 soldiers in 9 brigades. Many were veterans of World War II. They carried out 31 well-planned military operations. They attacked and depopulated 560,000 villages, and this made refugees out of 2/3 of the Palestinian people. Such massive depopulation could not have happened without much spilled blood. In 1948, Israel committed 156 massacres and atrocities. In a published study, we found a direct correlation between massacres in each village and the expulsion of its people. Refugees did not leave voluntarily. Massacres were a weapon of ethnic cleansing. In another published study, we found from ICRC documents and testimonies of survivors that Israel created 17 concentration camps and forced labor camps for the captured farmers from occupied villages. They put them to hard labor, digging trenches, burying the dead, carrying the loot from Arab homes, and other activities for the army. These concentration camps were opened in Israel 3 years after they were closed in Germany. How, one asked, how could these crimes go unnoticed in the West? All that took place in the mid-20th century under the watchful eye of the UN, in the age of telephone, telegraph, TV, and even the New York Times, which neither saw nor heard evil to report. The legacy goes on today. Today, evidence of war crimes in Gaza, Jerusalem, and West Bank opens the door for ICC trials for almost all members of the Israeli army. Here is another feature of the Israeli legacy. No colonial project in the world, save this Zionist Israeli one, has been riddled with more lies, deception, and misinformation. One lie: Palestine is a land without people. This lie, which had been persistent for a century, turned out not to be a lie, but a cover for a plan to make Palestine a land without people. It was the blueprint of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Another lie: Israel's legitimacy is based on the partition plan. The partition plan was a mere recommendation, if accepted, but it was not. In mid-March 1948, the UN and the US dropped it in favor of UN trusteeship. Ben-Gurion got mad. He reacted and started the invasion of Palestine, known as Plan Dalit. Another lie: Israel was in a state of self-defense. As I have just explained, the Zionist invasion took place in April 1948, before any Arab regular soldier entered Palestine to save the Palestinians from massacres and expulsion. Israel was the aggressor. Israel was not in self-defense. Another lie: Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. Well, I don't need to tell you much. The record of war crimes and massacres speaks for itself. Yet another lie: Israel is the only democracy on the Middle East. Israel is the only self-described apartheid country in the world. It says so in the nation-state law of July 2018. This is confirmed by reports of HRW, B'Tselem, ESQA, Goldstone, and the treaty-based conventions at the United Nations. Now, Omar Shakir will tell us more about that later. The list goes on. The Palestinians responded to the erasure of their history and geography by recording it. After Gaza's mass destruction, those young people who carried mementos of faded photographs waged a campaign of telling the truth in the uncensored social media. This is a weapon denied to them for 7 decades. In 1948, the Israeli seizure of Palestine was complete. The Zionists seized the land, but also all private and official documents, land title deeds, records of health, education, banks, agriculture, transport, airports, ports, and so on. But the refugees carried with them in exile, carried with them only their memories. Not too long after, the Palestinians started to record their history. Apart from formal history books, mostly in Arabic, 250 village books were written by the villagers themselves. Over 500 books of Palestinian memoirs were published. But in the formal scientific sphere, compendiums of atlases of Palestine were published, such as Atlas of Palestine in the year 1945, during the British Mandate, in 700 large pages, including 55,000 names of place names in Palestine. Atlas of Palestine in the year 1871 of Arab Palestine before the Zionist colonization, listing 13,000 Palestine place names. Map of Palestine in the year 1596 of the first Ottoman tax register, listing all localities, their population, their production, and their taxes. Map of Palestine in the year 313 AD, listing localities in Christian Palestine. Such record of Palestine, spanning 2,000 years, I maintain, is unmatched by any European history. Not one. This data, now computerized, open the door for implementing the right of return. As you know, it's affirmed by every article in international law. Detailed study we made out of the huge database we have, we made a study, detailed study of refugee village lands, refugee population, where they were, where they are now, who are the settlers living in their lands. This study revealed an astonishing result, long concealed by Israel, that the refugees' rural land is essentially empty, save for a small minority, and that 87% of Israeli Jews live in 12% of Israel, or even less. Now we have Palestinian young architects enter into an annual competition to reconstruct their villages. One irony is that the reconstruction cost of all destroyed villages together is less than the annual aid granted by the US for Israel's war. So the Palestinians can and must return and live in their homes in freedom, free from apartheid, racism, discrimination, occupation, and Zionism. All these evils must be abolished. I have a final note. What about the future? Could this colonial project continue? Can we venture a vision? This vision is anchored in the principle that justice must prevail, however long it takes. Today, let us consider these figures. Today, the Palestinians are 14 million people. Half of them are still on Palestine soil. And who is occupying their land? As to the figures of 2019, those lands are occupied by 6,750,000 Jews. This figure excludes 600,000 settlers in the West Bank, and it is to be compared with about 500,000 foreign workers in Israel. Now, looking only at Jews in Israel, they could be divided into the following four categories. One, 3 million Ashkenazi Jews, the founders. They all still occupy kibbutz and moshav with little replacement. The young don't go there. The young are educated, have foreign passports, live or travel frequently abroad. But within their society, they constitute the military-industrial economic complex, which is very difficult to break now. This complex represents the Jewish power alliance with USA, UK, and Germany. The second category is 1.25 Arab Jews, or Jews from Arab countries, who lost their wealth in Baghdad and Cairo in order to be Zionists. It's difficult for most of them to return, probably with the exception of Moroccan Jews. The third category is 1.5 million Russian economic immigrants who have no roots in Palestine, except those who reverted to their Eastern Orthodox Church, which has deep roots in Palestine. The fourth category, there is another extra 1 million miscellaneous Jews who came after the 1967 war to benefit from Israeli factories. So this is the structure of Israeli Jews today. When Israel is de-Zionized, there is no logistic problem. We can prove it over and over again. No logistic problem of accommodating those Jews who wish to live in a free democratic Palestine, free from Zionism and apartheid. But let us be practical. There will be two very difficult problems. The first problem is those die-hard fundamentalists, the Haredim, who consider themselves agents of God. Those must be disarmed and must convert themselves into a society like the Amish in USA or the Templars before them in Palestine. They can practice their religion in their colonies freely. The second very difficult problem is the military-industrial economic complex, which serves the Jewish world power. This complex is very difficult to undo, but it must be stripped of its hostile and warmongering mission. But if it turned to be peaceful, it could be housed in a Palestinian Silicon Valley. If this is not accepted, it could be moved to one Greek island, or perhaps to Dubai. They will be welcome there. It does not need an army to occupy a territory. This complex doesn't need an army to occupy a territory, kill and commit war crimes. And let me remind you, that is what happened to the German industry when the Germans, the Nazis, were defeated. It turned into a peaceful industrial complex. And of course, one can say these may be far-fetched ideas or may be immersed in a strong dose of optimism. But they have to be considered because there are indisputable facts. The Palestinians will survive and multiply. Now they are half the population, and they will continue to be much greater force. Those who live abroad are a potent force, as you know now, in the media and social media. But Palestinians will never accept to continue to live under Israeli apartheid, and they will always insist on implementing their right of return. And I conclude by this word. You know that very well. 100 years of Palestinian suffering and struggle to survive are enough. Enough. Now it is time for justice to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salman, for this wonderful presentation and thought-provoking, and that took us back to actually history and brought us into the present. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and commentary about this presentation. Our next presenter is Professor Richard Falk, and he will talk about Israel and the question of apartheid. Professor Falk.
Thank you very much, Professor El-Arian. I want to congratulate you, first of all, for this remarkable program that you have put together and the great activity that has emanated from Zion University since your presence there. It really has changed the landscape on these kind of issues that we're discussing tonight. And it's a pleasure, it's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel with two speakers who I admire greatly and have benefited from their work and contributions. Let me address this subject of the challenge of apartheid and how it relates to Israel and the overall Zionist movement. In my view, the more I've studied the evolution of Israel, the more I've come to the conclusion that an apartheid regime was inevitable given the fundamental elements of the Zionist project. And from the very beginning, it seems to me that the idea that a Jewish state could be created in a non-Jewish society at a time when colonialism was collapsing all over the world could only happen by an extraordinary combination of coercion applied to the indigenous population or the Palestinian people, backed by geopolitical forces externally. In other words, the undertaking of Zionism, the fundamental undertaking, was contrary to the flow of history. And by being contrary to the flow of history, it meant two things. It meant that there would encounter resistance because Palestinian people were part of the rise of indigenous nationalism all over the non-Western world. And in the period where Israel was established, anti-colonialism was both legitimated at an international level and victorious in a series of wars. In other words, the project of Zionism, because it flowed against the historical, because it was in tension with the historical circumstances, led to resistance and to unprecedented coercive repression of that resistance. And that interaction has occurred throughout this long period of Israel's existence. And it is embedded in the very structure, not only of the coercive mechanisms, but of the ideology of the state. The ideology of the state, which is premised on the domination of one people by another, and implicitly involves discrimination and exploitation and victimization. It is contrary in this sense to the ideas of fundamental ideas of human rights and the prohibition of racial discrimination. And also, it's complicated. I mean, not only was this historical challenge, but there was also the fact that unlike South Africa, the paradigmatic example of apartheid governance, the Zionist movement sought to be a constitutional democracy. And that being a constitutional democracy with a programmatic feature of Jewish supremacy meant that there had to be ethnic cleansing to ensure the demographic majority. So it was a form, in one sense, of aggravated apartheid because it extended its claims, which supported the myth of the only democracy in the Middle East, and contributed to its legitimacy and acceptance at the international level. But this could only happen through ethnic cleansing, and as has been so vividly described by Dr. Abu Sita, it involved the crimes associated with the Nakba, both as an event and as a process, which continues. In other words, the Nakba was not a kind of gratuitous excess that occurred in the process of establishing Israel. It was embedded in the ideology of Zionism and the carrying out of the Zionist project. And it was because of this demographic imperative, it also entailed a denial of the right of return to people who had been forced to leave their homeland and their country at under, as has been said, under very violent conditions, so that the ethnic cleansing was coupled with this denial of the right of return, which is a continuing crime against humanity and is part of the distinctive features that apartheid has evolved into through time in Israel. There is also the issue that is completely suppressed in the Israeli narrative, which is the denial of the right of self-determination to the people who inhabited the country. And as we were told, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish population of Palestine was less than 10%. And that kind of, creating this kind of Jewish state in this sort of non-Jewish societal and cultural atmosphere was something that contradicted in the most fundamental ways the rise of self-determination as the defining feature of legitimate national sovereignty. In other words, national sovereignty prior to Second World War had several different kind of legitimating features, including de facto possession, even conquest. But after World War II, and with the rise of the anti-colonial ideology as given strong support within the international community, the notion of self-determination was the fundamental foundation of legitimate statehood, and continues to be. And one of the mistakes I think that the Palestinians made was to subscribe to the Oslo diplomacy without the affirmation of that right of self-determination, which really was a kind of normative and a tactical diplomatic failure, and infected the whole process that went on for 25 years. It is in this context of the inevitability of apartheid going against the historical context that one has to take notice of the peculiar external circumstances that shielded Israeli criminality from any kind of accountability. And that is partly a reflection of the sense of guilt and failure of the liberal democracies to combat the persecution of Jews in Europe, the denial of access to Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 1940s. And so the colonial mentality, the Orientalist mentality, was comfortable with solving Euro-American guilt at the expense of a non-Western people. In other words, imposing this kind of sanctuary, as it was thought to be, for Jews, for surviving Jews after the Holocaust, and that cast a whole shadow over the process by which the Palestinians were expelled from their own homeland, and Israel was accepted in the international community. And the United States increasingly played a role as the geopolitical guarantor of this fundamental denial of rights of the Palestinian people. And that role of guarantor became a strategic partnership after the 1967 war, where prior to that there was kind of ambiguity in the governmental circles because of the strategic importance of oil and keeping friendship with the Arab governments. After the 67 war, the grand strategy of the U.S. converged with the pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli lobbying efforts within the United States and created this unconditional acceptance of impunity for Israeli criminality. And it's that situation that has led to this crystallization of the most important post-South African example of apartheid. And I want to emphasize in bringing my remarks to a close that the apartheid challenge is so fundamental to an understanding of the Israel-Palestine relationship for two reasons. One is, the first is that it really is an encompassing criminality. We know that apartheid is criminalized in Article 7 of the ICC Rome Statute as a crime against humanity. And it's the notion that this relationship based on supremacy and victimization of people based on their racial identity encompasses all the other crimes. And so it is impossible to imagine a sustainable and just peace without the dismantling of apartheid. In other words, it's a precondition to a circumstance of where peace is premised on the equality of the two peoples, and that can only happen in a framework, political framework that de-Zionizes Israel and empowers non-Jews as fully entitled to every form of equality, so that any peace process is only seeking a form of ceasefire unless it addresses apartheid. And the international community has failed consistently to acknowledge this fundamental structural impediment to a genuine peace. And I would say that the idea of finding the political will to change the orientation of Israeli leadership and the recognition of these underlying facts by the Palestinian leadership is really a crucial challenge at this time. And I think the new context after the recent surge of violence suggests Palestinian unity is at an unprecedented level now, and the questioning of the unconditional geopolitical support for Israel has risen to heights. And I would say in closing that this set of conditions seems amenable to introducing the apartheid discourse as integral to a future genuine peace process. And we're very fortunate to have Omar Shakar here as who has authored the Human Rights Watch report, which takes us to this place where there is finally an explicit recognition of the central and fundamental importance of apartheid. So let me stop there, and thank you for your listening attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, very much for your thoughtful remarks. And I'm sure we're going to get back to you on several issues, several questions. Now we'll turn to Omar, in which he will explore the report that's been mentioned several times. Everybody's looking forward to it. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Professor El-Erian, and all the organizers for putting together this really important and timely conversation. And let me say what an honor it is to be with for Dr. Abu Sitta and Professor Falk. And of course, Professor Falk's work on apartheid really has been, we wouldn't be here today without that work that he's done in particular. So it's a great honor to follow him as well. Dr. Abu Sitta, I think, really importantly started us off in the right place, which is the Nakba, which is so central as historical context to the situation we face today. And I think Professor Falk's linking the Nakba to today was, a really important contribution, and as well as his really comprehensive account. What I'll try and do in my, 18, 19 minutes is to really in brief lay out the findings of the Human Rights Watch report, how we arrived at them, the law that our report is premised on, our main recommendations, and the way forward. And I really look forward to the discussion. Let me start by saying that Human Rights Watch, of course, has been documenting human rights abuse in Israel and Palestine for well over 3 decades. Over the years, discrimination became more and more a central theme, of our work. And while we've documented important aspects of discrimination across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, so whether it be the unrecognized villages of the Negev, whether it be the situation in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, this report emerged out of a sense that our reports were failing to speak to the underlying reality on the ground, a reality in which a single government rules over an area, primarily, that being the Israeli government over the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, where 2 groups of roughly equal size live, and where that government has methodically privileged one group, Jewish Israelis, and systematically repressed the other group, Palestinians, to varying degrees of intensity, with Jewish Israelis governed under the same laws, with the same privileges and rights wherever they live, while Palestinians are discriminated against wherever they live. When we looked at that factual reality and we compared it against where the international conversation is on Israel-Palestine today, we felt a disconnect. The international conversation for so long has been premised on assumptions that don't match the reality on the ground. The idea that a 54-year occupation is temporary. The idea that Palestinians have self-rule when 90% of the land is under exclusive Israeli control, and where the remaining 10%, the Israeli government retains control over the movement of people and goods, the resources, the borders, the airspace, the water space, the population registry, and on and on and on. The idea that Israel is a democracy when it rules over nearly 5 million Palestinians who have no say for decades on end over the government that in practice rules over their life. And the idea that a 30-year peace process, as Professor Folk mentioned, can on its own dismantle systematic oppression. This 213-page report looks at years of Human Rights Watch research. We attempt to connect the dots between the research we've done over decades, as well as new case studies and research conducted for this report, such as a review of government planning documents, statements by officials, moreover. Then we compared the facts that we documented against the established international law on discrimination. There is a universal prohibition on severe discrimination and systematic oppression known as apartheid. While the term was of course coined in relation to South Africa, international treaties, including the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, define apartheid as a universal legal term. And in fact, there are conventions that define it as a crime against humanity, including not only a 1974 convention, but also the 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. As a crime against humanity, apartheid basically refers to three things when they come together. One is an intent by one group of people to dominate another. The second is systematic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. And the third element are particularly grave abuses known as inhumane acts. So intent to dominate, systematic oppression, and inhumane acts. Again, we're thinking about it as act, inhumane acts, intent to dominate, and context, systematic oppression. There is a related crime against humanity of persecution, which refers to severe discriminatory oppression when combined with, which refers to, this sort of severe discrimination along with a discriminatory intent. So severe abuses of fundamental rights, discriminatory intent. So when Human Rights Watch applied the facts that we documented to the law, we compared the two, we reached the conclusion that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. This finding is premised on an intent or a policy we documented by the Israeli government to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across the areas under its control, which has been combined with the severe repression that takes place in the occupied territory. Let me briefly walk through the elements of the crimes that I laid out and the ways in which we applied the law, starting with the intent prong. Our research shows that the Israeli government has sought to maximize control over demographics and land for the benefit of Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians. When it comes to demographics, the Israeli government has adopted policies openly aimed at combating the, quote, demographic threat that Palestinians pose. To take two examples, a 2003 Knesset law, which has been renewed every year since, and is actually now up for debate as we speak in the Knesset during this very period, in effect allows for, in fact, mandates the effective denial of permanent legal status to Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip married to Israeli citizens or residents, a restriction that does not exist for the foreign spouses of Israelis from virtually any other country. Another example, of course, and Professor Folk went into this in great depth, is the fact that a Jewish American can tomorrow move to Israel and is eligible for automatic citizenship, even if they have no connection to Israel proper, while a Palestinian who's been languishing for decades, in a refugee camp mere kilometers away from their homes is denied the right of return. That's a clear example, of an intent to dominate. When it comes to land, Israeli policy across Israel and the occupied territory has sought to maximize the land available for Jewish Israelis and confine Palestinians into dense enclaves. This policy takes different forms, but to advance the same aim. So, for example, inside Israel proper, the Israeli government has a policy to, quote, Judaize the Negev and the Galilee, regions that account for 2/3 of the land inside Israel and much of the Palestinian population. In these areas, Israeli law permits hundreds of small Jewish towns and communities to exclude Palestinians from living there. And in fact, a study done by a professor at Haifa University found that a university in Haifa found that there are 900 small Jewish towns across the country that have no Palestinians living among them. Inside Jerusalem, the municipality, which incorporates occupied East Jerusalem, as well as West Jerusalem, the municipality's planning document sets out the objective of, quote, maintaining a solid Jewish majority in the city, and even sets out target demographic ratios it hopes to maintain between Jewish Israelis and between Palestinians. That plan also talks about densification and thickening of Palestinian neighborhoods to advance this objective. In the West Bank, the dynamic plays out most clearly, where government plans that span decades, for example, the 1980 Drobles plans that have guided settlement policy, sets out the objective of, quote, to settle the land between the Arab minority population centers and their surroundings, noting that doing so would, quote, make it hard for Palestinians to create territorial continuity and political unity and remove any trace of doubt about our intent to control Judea and Samaria forever. The massive land grabs and significant investment in infrastructure like roads and water networks, electricity, to connect Israel to the settlements make clear the intent for permanent domination. Even in the Gaza Strip, although the Israeli government withdrew its settler population in 2005, our study of the government's policy in the 16 years since shows the ways in which the same objective is advanced. Israel has pursued a policy that it calls its separation policy between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The way it's enforced this policy makes clear that demographics lie at the core of the plan. The Israeli government has in effect barred Palestinians from Gaza from moving to the West Bank, even though it's a single territorial unit. And this has been done in order to, in effect, turn Gaza into a demographic receptacle, an open-air prison for 2 million Palestinians caged in a 40 by 11 kilometer territory of land in order to consolidate, gerrymander a Jewish majority across the West Bank and Israel proper. These policies amount to an intent to dominate, one of the elements of apartheid, and a discriminatory intent, one of the elements of persecution. The second part of our analysis looks at the two-tiered system Israel has implemented to advance this intent. The means used by the Israeli government in the occupied territory amount to systematic oppression, the second element of apartheid. Let me give a few examples of the systematic oppression on the ground today. One is the imposition of draconian military rule over 2.7 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, while Jewish Israeli settlers, hundreds of thousands, are governed under Israeli civil law, meaning that if a Palestinian and a Jewish Israeli in the West Bank commit a crime today, they may live across the street. They are tried in different courts where they receive different due process rights, and they can receive different sentences for the very same crime. The Israeli government also enforces segregation in the West Bank. Palestinians cannot enter settlements except as laborers bearing special permits. And the Israeli government has plundered the land and resources of Palestinians. And of the land it's redistributed, 99+%, according to government data, has been given to Jewish Israelis living in illegal settlements. Of course, similar dynamics prevail in East Jerusalem. Take the recent escalation and events that have happened there. At core, there is a 1970 Israeli law that allows Jewish Israelis to reclaim land in East Jerusalem that they say they owned before 1948. However, the families set to be displaced are themselves refugees. whose land and property was taken away from them inside Israel and who are denied under Israeli the right to reclaim that land and property. Same issue, reclamation of land before 1948, different outcomes based on who you are, even though one is an occupied territory and the other refers to people's decades or generations long homes. And of course, in the Gaza Strip, we see systematic oppression, not only in the hostilities, which we can talk about more in the question and answer, but in the fact that the Israeli government for 14 years has imposed a generalized closure. This is a ban on the movement of all 2 million Palestinians, except if you fit within a range of narrow humanitarian exemptions. In addition, there are sweeping restrictions on the movement of people and goods, which has crippled the economy in Gaza. 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid. The majority of families spend the majority of their days without electricity. Let me say a word about security. Many of these abuses, of course, are justified in the name of security, but the abuse is at the core of apartheid and persecution. The land grabs, the discriminatory denial of building permits or residency revocations have no legitimate security justification. And even where security is a consideration, the Israeli government's means have gone far beyond what international law authorizes. And security no more justifies apartheid and persecution than it would justify torture or indiscriminate force taken in the name of security. The third and final part of our analysis looks at the abuses carried out by the Israeli government in furtherance of the intent to dominate and within the context of systematic oppression. Human Rights Watch documented 5 clusters of inhumane acts in the occupied Palestinian territory. Let me briefly go through them. 1 are the sweeping movement restrictions. I mentioned the closure of Gaza. In the West Bank, the Israeli government has imposed a permit regime, meaning that Palestinians require difficult to obtain permits to enter large swaths of the West Bank. In addition, the Israeli government has built nearly 600 checkpoints and other closure obstacles spread throughout the West Bank, which can turn a short commute into an hours-long humiliating ordeal, while Jewish Israelis have largely unfettered movement. And finally, the Israeli government built the separation barrier in large part on Palestinian land, separating farmers from the agricultural land and communities from their schools, hospitals, and family. The second inhumane act we document is the mass confiscation of Palestinian land, more than 1/3 of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This has reduced Palestinians to living in the West Bank in 165 disconnected territorial enclaves. The third inhumane act that we document are the coercive conditions in East Jerusalem and in Area C, the majority of the West Bank under Israel's exclusive rule, where it is effectively impossible to get a building permit if you're a Palestinian. Between 2016 and 2018, the Israeli government issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians in Area C. There are today, as we speak, 46 Palestinian communities at risk of full demolition. And of course, the Israeli government has razed schools, businesses, and thousands of homes over the years. The fourth inhumane act we document are the sweeping denial of residency rights. More than 500,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip who lost their legal right to live there because they were abroad for too long, because they weren't there in 1967 when the occupation began, or because of the freeze in the population registry effectively in place since 2000. And the final inhumane act we document are the suspension of civil rights for the 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for 54 years, the right to free speech, assembly, and association. These findings are the most stark that Human Rights Watch has ever reached on the conduct of Israeli authorities. It's the first time we've documented crimes against humanity. Our recommendations are in line with where we found crimes of this magnitude elsewhere in the world. I'll conclude with just the 6 recommendations and a final couple of words after that. We have 6 main recommendations for the international community, beyond the obvious ones, of course, that we have for the Israeli government and apartheid and persecution, and several to the Palestinians and other actors. But for the international community, we call first for recognition that these crimes are taking place and statements highlighting them. Secondly, we called for a UN Commission of Inquiry to look into systematic discrimination based on group identity. I'm pleased to share that the UN has set up such a Commission of Inquiry using the language from our report, but we also call for the UN to appoint a global envoy for the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Third, we call for the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute those Israeli officials implicated in the crime, as well as for national courts to do so under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Fourth, we call for targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans against those Israeli officials implicated in the crimes. Fifth, the conditioning of all arms sales and military and security assistance to Israel on authorities taking steps to end apartheid. And 6, for the vetting of all bilateral and multilateral agreements and engagement with Israel to ensure non-complicity in the crime, to mitigate human rights abuse, and where that's not possible, to end those activities. These asks boil down to the following, which is where I'll conclude my remarks. A 54-year occupation is not temporary. A 30-plus year peace process will not, on its own, dismantle systematic oppression. Millions of Palestinians denied their fundamental rights solely because of who they are, solely because they were born Palestinian and not Jewish, is not simply a matter of abusive occupation. The first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. The wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong conclusion. Apartheid is no longer a hypothetical or a future scenario, as it was in 1974 when Yitzhak Rabin warned about it, or in 2006 when Jimmy Carter did, or even in 2014 when John Kerry warned that apartheid was around the corner. Apartheid is the present-day reality for millions of Palestinians. It's not just Human Rights Watch that's saying it. It's not just Professor Falk. It's not just the Palestinians who've been telling us this for years and decades, and too many didn't listen. We now have several major Israeli human rights groups, including B'Tselem. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen 2 former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa acknowledge that what Palestinians face is apartheid, as well as the governments of South Africa, Namibia, and many, many more. Those who strive for Israeli-Palestinian peace, whether in a one-state, a two-state solution, or a confederation, should acknowledge reality for what it is, should have the courage to fight apartheid and to bring to bear the sorts of human rights tools a situation of this gravity warrants. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you, the 3 of you, for these incredible presentations. I think the 3 of you have drawn a picture of what the reality is in Palestine across, particularly in the occupied territories. I think you have made, again, collectively with your presentation, and certainly beyond that, that what we have today in Palestine, in the Palestinian occupied territories, is a state of apartheid. It's a bit different, and it's probably even worse, as some South African scholars would term it, that this is even worse than what South Africa had experienced in the past in many ways. So what we have now is try to engage you in a discussion. Now that we have established the facts, I would like to engage, each one of you, and then perhaps we can get engaged collectively. I want to just start first with Omar, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Suleiman and then to Professor Richard. Omar, what kind of reaction did you get to the report, particularly from governments, if any?
Thank you, Professor El-Erian. I mean, I have to say the response to our report has been, really a sea change, as I think Professor Falk remarked. Let me say, first of all, in closed-door meetings with government officials, nobody has challenged our facts. And I've met probably 24 governments at different levels in the 2 months around our report launch. Not one person has said, the facts are wrong. There have been questions around the strategy and where do we go from here. And it's not just what they've said in private. I mean, look at public statements. I mentioned that South Africa and Namibia not only endorsed our findings, they invited me and others to a UN General Assembly side event last week where they endorsed the recommendations in the report. Luxembourg's foreign minister has referred to apartheid. France's foreign minister has said that the status quo produces an apartheid reality. I mean, that's a number of significant governments that have brought it up. I expect we'll see more in the days ahead. Beyond just government officials, I think the sea changes come when you look elsewhere. I mean, parliaments across the world, U.S. Congress people, but European Parliament, Belgian Parliament. I mean, it's become sort of moved into the kind of mainstream discourse among those parties and groups that speak out on Palestinian human rights. And if you go beyond the space of government, you see civil society groups, of course, not just the Israeli and Palestinian groups that have already spoken out on this, but even progressive, American Jewish Zionist groups that have, welcomed the discussion very much. And then you can go beyond that. You can look at media icons, commentators on MSNBC, John Oliver. You can look at pop culture and find Dua Lipa. You can find, models that have sort of spoken out on this. It's not just the Human Rights Watch report. I want to be clear. This is the work, of many academics and scholars and human rights groups over many years. But I do think we've neared a tipping point. That's a huge step forward. We have our work cut out for us. There's still, more we can do with governments and with others. And of course, we need to translate the shift in paradigm, of course, into concrete improvements on the ground. So our work is cut out for us. But I do think, going back to the theme of this conference, I think reclaiming the narrative, I think the narrative has shifted significantly. And, I think we're approaching one that looks like the situation on the ground, at least in many circles, which is not where we were for years, if not decades.
And what are the main points of the critics? What are they trying to say? What are they trying to argue?
Frankly, you will not find you'll find much ink spilt around our report in 2 months, including criticism. I don't think you'll find a single word challenging how we apply about the facts or how we applied the law to the facts out there. Most of the criticisms have either been ad hominem that have sought to attack, and this is, Professor Falk and others, and of course, you, Professor Ariane, are familiar with these kind of disingenuous efforts to kind of shift the topic, shift the conversation, attack Human Rights Watch or myself. Or, when they engage on the merits, it's a straw man argument. It's trying to sort of argue what we're not saying. Well, it's different than South Africa. Well, what about this? What about that? It's sort of disingenuously not actually dealing with our argument. It's either misrepresenting it or trying to make historical or a comparative comparison. That's the work of academics. We are a human rights organization across the world. We document facts. We apply the law. When we do that in a cold, clear way, and it's impossible to sort of deny when you look at it. And that's, why Professor Falk has been writing about this for a number of years, that reality on the ground. So, when people sort of engage, when there are substantive arguments, they may say, well, what about, Palestinians who are citizens inside Israel and vote in the Knesset and et cetera. And of course, we're very clear in our report that the means of repression, vary. And of course, there's a high threshold to meet that of apartheid. And as you saw in my presentation, we talk about the inhumane acts and systematic oppression in the occupied territory. At the same token, of course, there is systematic discrimination that Palestinians inside Israel face, and that reflects the intent to dominate. The idea that there are two separate systems and that what Palestinian citizens of Israel face when it comes to discrimination in land, or, I didn't mention in my presentation, for example, we have pages on the situation in the Negev, where there are 35 villages unrecognized by the Israeli government, 90,000 residents who live effectively illegally in their own home, or the fact that, that there are, that Palestinians encompass 19% of the population inside Israel, yet the majority of whom live on 3% of the land. You can go through the two-tiered citizenship structure, the bifurcation between citizenship and nationality, the land, the resource discrimination. That, of course, all reflects the intent to dominate. So that's one example. You can find other criticisms, but I'll I'm very eager to hear other panelists. I'll stop there.
I want to thank you. I can't commend you or thank you enough on Human Rights Watch for having released this important report. Dr. Salman, I want to ask you a little bit. I mean, it's so obvious what this report has argued, and as Omar said, there is very little argument with its findings, yet we see the Palestinian Authority dealing with it like it's nothing. I mean, it's like nothing has changed in its behavior, in its attitude towards how it approaches the Palestinian problem. What do you say?
That is the question I'd like to pose to our friend, Professor Richard. Two things. One is, how come international law is impotent regarding the Palestinian case? Is there any advantage in calling the General Assembly to meet for United for Peace, as they have done in 1950 in the case of Korea, to avoid the vetoes of the Security Council? Would that work in reality? Of course, we assume that 170 member states are favorable to the case of Palestine. So how can we avoid the block set up by Western powers against the international law implementation? That's number one. Number two, the Statute of Rome 1998 stops at year 2012, counting the war crimes from that date onwards. What about the crimes committed in 1948? Is there any logic in saying that if a criminal kills and kills and kills all the time, and he's caught in the day 100, can you take him to court for the crime he committed in day 1? Because it is a continuous crime. Continuity of a crime is it not a reason to go beyond or before 2012? In other words, can we bring all these war criminals to the crimes committed continuously for 26,300 days before the Rome Statute?
Okay, Richard, these are questions are for you. I don't know if you're muted. Are you muted? Yes, you're muted.
Did you hear me, Richard?
Yeah, he did, but he's muted. He will unmute himself. And
Now
yes, go ahead.
unmute. Those are very good questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. International law, when it touches on fundamental issues, is subordinate to the primacy of geopolitics. And there's no doubt about that. The UN was premised on that foundation. Otherwise, the veto power doesn't make any sense. Why would you give the most dangerous 5 countries in 1945, or at least the most powerful countries, the right to exempt themselves from international law while you hold all the others potentially accountable? It only made sense. There were many reasons for this deference, including accommodating the Soviet Union that was fearful of being outvoted in the UN and probably wouldn't have joined if it hadn't been given some kind of protection of this sort. But the constitutional effect is to say, when international law clashes with geopolitical priorities, international law is not implemented. And the complementary view is when international law reinforces geopolitics, it becomes very important, very much emphasized, as it was in relation to Libya, for instance, in 2011, or when the Iranians, after the revolution in 1978, seized the American embassy. When international law is on the side of geopolitics, it becomes a very potent instrument. But when it collides with geopolitics, it depends on popular mobilization to undermine the geopolitical edge that is part of especially American foreign policy. And so the challenge is on that level. At the same time, one shouldn't think that international law is not important for all the reasons that we've been discussing tonight. It changes the discourse as to what grievances are legitimate, what crimes are taking place. The fact that the ICC a few months ago authorized investigations into Israeli crimes in the occupied territory post 2014, I guess, is an enormous symbolic victory for the Palestinian people. And symbolic victories often are preludes to controlling political outcomes. I like to emphasize the fact that most of the anti-colonial wars were won by the weaker side militarily. And what does that tell us? It tells us that the side that wins the legitimacy war often controls the outcome. It goes against the realist consensus that history is made by military power. But I think if you look at the last 75 years, one sees a different pattern, particularly in wars that are fought for the control of sovereign authority.
Richard, since we have you, if you could comment on the fact, at what point do great powers who really don't care about international law or don't care about justice, they start bending and they start adhering to what people want them to do, which is the right thing, which is basically do away with injustice and try to institute a system where people's rights are not trampled upon, like what happened at the end of apartheid South Africa. At what point would these great powers start listening? What do we need to do?
Sammy, to begin with, if your premise is not one that I share, because great powers have shaped international law. International law has been used by them as a tool of imperial control over resources, over foreign societies, over legitimating the outcome of wars, for many reasons. It is when international law collides with their geopolitical priorities, and that's not the normal situation. We're talking about something that is quite unusual historically, that where you have these obvious collisions between what is legally mandated and what is geopolitically prioritized.
So basically saying there is no point in going and try to raise international law because great powers would always impose their will?
No, I'm saying they will impose their will, they will try to impose their will in situations where they seem to be defying international law, as long as they can do it. You asked the proper question about how do you identify the tipping point when they no longer will adhere to a geopolitically driven foreign policy. And
I
that
think
happened.
of Reagan towards the end of apartheid South Africa, where he had to change because everyone else wasn't there and he was alone.
Well, he's almost been. The U.S. has almost been alone for years with sanctions for Cuba. A whole bunch of policies. That it's the political pressure from below that changes the geopolitical calculations. That's what happened in South Africa itself. Well, it didn't have a moral awakening to get rid of apartheid. It changed the pragmatic understanding of what was better for its future.
Let me ask you a question, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Salman. Omar gave us 6 recommendations. Many of them have to do with, having basically governments and states adopting them and pressuring them. What are the odds of this?
It depends on how much global civil society is mobilized and supports these kinds of recommendations. It also depends on whether a coalition of governments finally emerges that will push for action that is of the sort that really did isolate South Africa in the last stages of apartheid. One can learn a lot by how South Africa was induced to give up apartheid. And under much more dubious circumstances. The black population outnumbered the whites by 4-1. In Israel, as Omar mentioned, it's approximately equal.
1-to-1.
And, it was a big risk for South Africans to suddenly, after all the abuse they had imposed on the majority population, to risk turning the country over to those that they had victimized so severely for so long.
Mm. Dr. Salman, you did mention about the problems within the Israeli society, particularly among secular religious. You talked about the Haredim. You talked about, of course, the secular and the military-industrial complex. Do you see these fault lines within that society as also basis for the collapse of that society, or do you see them all united in their attempt, in their quest to colonize Palestine and establish Greater Israel? And also, I wanted you to comment on the performance of the so-called Palestinian Authority and how some of these recommendations that they cannot really advance much without a Palestinian being, and I'm talking about Palestinian leadership, whether in civil society or whether in politics, trying to advance this and push them forward. What do you think?
Well, as we all know from history, victory always brings followers, brings supporters. If there is a victory, people want to belong to that victorious team. And if there is the opposite, then they all disavow their relationship with that. So as long as Israel is strong militarily and supported basically by the Western powers, all the diverse elements in Israel would like to be part of that team. Let us remember that Israelis who live there now, Israeli Jews, come from 110 countries. They speak about 100 languages or dialects. What combines them together is that Israel so far has the upper hand. And we can see that, I just said that 1 million people, or less than that, namely the Russians, came after 1967 war. Now, this is very fragile, absolutely fragile.
Actually, mainly after 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's one thing. And 1967, of course, gained more momentum for Jews to There are two things which are changing now. First one is that the young people in Palestine, Palestinians, especially those who live abroad. Let us say there are 7 million living abroad. Half of them are living in Jordan. So in Australia, America, and South America, and so on, there are young people who are now making up 70% of all Palestinian people. And those young people are rid of all the chains which their fathers have held, namely being meek and weak and being uninformed and they are confident, they are knowledgeable, they really will carry the torch. I have great faith in them, and I have seen them, visited them in many, many countries, and I think they will have something to say. Before we leave that point, let me go back to Israel. Israel is very fragile. The distance between Gaza and Hebron and West Bank is only 45 kilometers. And most of the people there, it's really empty, in the exception of Beersheba and Asqalan and so on. So it's very empty. Also, the same distance goes from southern Lebanon, from Maron al-Ras to Jenin. It's less than 35 kilometers. And most of the people who live there are Palestinians. 50% in Al-Jalil are Palestinians. The attack on Gaza and the rise in Jerusalem created one thing which we have been hoping for a long time, namely Palestine, all of it has become one nation, instead of being fragmented into 4, 5, 6 pieces. So this trend is very important. Now, you brought the question of Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority is the product of Oslo, which is worse to the Palestinian case more than Balfour Declaration. It's the first time that the occupier sits with the occupied and say, let us divide what I have taken from you. And talking about 80% is for Israeli Jews and 20% for all the Palestinians in the world, is something unusual. Even the case of the two-state solution is originally an Israeli invention. It was an invention to say that 80% don't talk about it. Let us divide 20% between us. And now, in terms of Palestinian people, the Palestinian Authority, at the moment, has no credibility among Palestinians. There are even open surveys which shows that 3/4 of the Palestinians, even the West Bank and other places, they do not want the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has been created to serve the Israeli occupation. 89% or 98% of products coming into West Bank are Israeli. 78% of all aid coming to the PA is channeled through Israel. So Israel has great interest in that. Now, in terms of their legitimacy to lead the Palestinian people, it's almost nil. Even by all standards, I am a member of the Palestine National Council, and we have not met for 33 years under legal considerations. And so the people in the West Bank at most represent 18% of all Palestinians. Actually, they don't represent that. They represent probably the interests of 42,000 soldiers who are paid by the United States, and also 100,000 of civil staff who live on aid. And the rest of the people have no confidence at all. Palestinians, as you, I'm sure, well aware, have, for at least since Oslo, made many petitions, conferences, and so on, calling for election of a new Palestine National Council, in which 14 million people would vote. This is the only representative of Palestinian people. Now, this movement to elect a new Palestinian National Council is growing. It will have a lot of road to cross because there are many forces against it. But to conclude, I have great faith in the young people. They will not stay idle. They are confident, they are knowledgeable, and they will probably turn the tide in favor of Palestinians.
Thank you, Umar. I want to follow up on your last point, which was the 6 recommendations. Who would be responsible for advancing them, for making them a reality on the ground? I mean, some of them, it seems to me, as Richard said, that they need a state or a combination of states. Are you just suggesting recommendations, or are you in a position to push some of these recommendations at least to be taken seriously? And what, I mean, obviously it hasn't been but a few months since this was released. What has been the reaction in Congress?
Yeah, I think the recommendations that I focused on, again, the report has 5-6 pages full of recommendations, some specific to specific governments, some to UN bodies, some to corporations, the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. So I kind of blended them together in this presentation. I think the most of the ones I presented are to governments, and we specify those are to the US, to the EU, and to all states. And there's also, as I said, the prosecutor one right now. The new prosecutor has that file in front of them. The court has confirmed jurisdiction. There's an open investigation. But most of the other ones are to states. Human Rights Watch also conducts advocacy. That's part of what we do. We document abuse, we investigate, we document, we expose, and we advocate for change. So certainly that's going to be part of what we do. I mean, this report will be central to our Israel-Palestine advocacy for weeks, months, years to come. Part of that effort was the formation, for example, of the Commission of Inquiry at the UN. I think our initial goal with this report really was the paradigm shift to get more and more states and other actors to acknowledge apartheid and persecution. We see that shift happening. We think the next sort of natural next step will be action at the UN. We've seen that now with the Commission of Inquiry. There's a related call we have for a global envoy for the crimes of apartheid and persecution. We found also apartheid and persecution, for example, in the treatment of the Rohingya in Burma and Myanmar. So we want somebody with a mandate to sort of advance the law, the doctrines, and push for ending those situations. We think that's something that we could, get at the UN in the short run. And most of the other recommendations, whether it be the targeted sanctions on implicated officials, their prosecutions, investigations, the arms sales, conditionality, and if conditions aren't met, cutting that, aid, as well as the kind of bilateral engagement and sort of ending forms of that make one complicit in the crimes. All those things are consistent with where we found crimes against humanity. But Professor Falk is right to say that, it's going to take political will. And obviously, we know what geopolitics is like today. So our recommendations at Human Rights Watch focuses on rights bearers, right? So we focus on governments and, corporations and non-state groups that hold responsibilities, et cetera. We don't make, calls for, mainstream everyday people to act. But it's clear that that's the sort of shift that's going to be needed to create the political sort of support for states to take those actions. So certainly we'll play a role. I will say that, again, many people we meet, get it. They sort of know what the reality is on the ground. And so I think the information gap is being met. And now it's a matter sort of there being the political will to take actions. I agree some states are shifting. They already have that there, the global south, some parts of Europe. That will need to be built on, and there will, of course, need to be movement, because we can expect resistance, and there has been resistance, and there is ongoing resistance, not only by the Israeli government, not only by the United States, but even by other states in Europe, Canada, Australia. So there will be a need for a shift to happen. But, we at Human Rights Watch issue recommendations that the facts are warranted by the facts and the reality on the ground, even when we know that this is going to take a long time to reach. Let me just say, as an ending point, this is not unique to Israel-Palestine, right? I covered Egypt, for Human Rights Watch before I covered Israel-Palestine. I wrote the report on the Rab'a massacre, the mass killings of protesters that took place in 2013. We called for many of these same things. We found likely crimes against humanity. And here we are, 7 years after the report, 8 years after, the massacre, and those that committed the abuses remain in power. There have not been, movements towards accountability. I mean, there have been other shifts, but the point here is these are long-term battles, and even where the law and the facts are on your side, that's not, given the way international law is, that's not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, and it's going to take other things happening, and I hope that Dr. Abu Sitta is right about some of the shifts that are happening in terms of, different actors, and hopefully we can get to a place where human rights and justice are at the top of the agenda.
Okay, I'll get back to you, but Dr. Abu Sitta would have to leave us, so I'm going to give him his 3 minutes or 4 minutes of summation if he would like to address us, because each speaker would have gotten that at the end. Dr. Abu Sitta, if you want to say anything.
Thank you. Thank you again, Professor Sami. I think the Palestinians have a weapon nobody can dispute, namely their resilience and their steadfastness. Who would imagine 10 years back that 2 million people in a big concentration camp would keep the Israelis at bay for 51 days in 2014 and for 11 days last week or last month? Nobody can imagine that. Who could imagine, for example, before 1987, there is something called Hamas will be formed? Who could imagine before 1964 there would be Fatah be formed and carry the burden for at least a good part of 2 decades? Who could imagine in 1950, on the morrow of the Nakba, that Fidaiyin from Gaza keep fighting and trying to get back to their homes? So the resilience of the Palestinian people is a great weapon, and now, as I said, enhanced by people who have knowledge, experience, and determination. I have seen many young people say, our parents were not strong enough to do that. They should have put a bigger fight. Of course, at that time things were different. And so I am very confident that the young people will carry the torch. Now, there is a great deal of war against them. For example, in many Arab countries, the history and geography of Palestine is diluted a lot. And that's why people sometimes have evening classes about Palestine and so on. This is a deliberate part of the war. After taking the land, then you occupy the mind of people. But this has failed. Mainly, we are lucky to have something called internet and social media and so on. But that's not enough. The situation in Arab countries has been all the time, they were holding the banner of Palestine. Many of them, with exceptions of course, have dropped that banner. Some of them actually moved to the other side so blatantly that they become more dangerous, more hostile to Palestinians than some aspect of the Israeli plan. And that is because, of course, they have no democracy. Take the case of Kuwait, for example. There is democracy, and there is parliament, and there is a popular opinion of the people. And so they and the government are in one hand. Even if they disagree, there is a balance between them. If there is an absence of democracy, when the ruler decides what situation should be taken, then we have these people who deviated from the right path and become agent of Israel, or actually basically agent of America, thinking that being friendly with Israel is the answer to them. But again, I do not take today's events, bad events, as a sign of the future. We know for sure that this is not a an indication of the real situation. So, in conclusion, I would say the persistence and steadfastness of the Palestinians and the rise of the public opinion to their side, it actually showed one thing. The edifice created by Zionism to silence the voice of Palestinians and to silence the facts about Palestine has been cracked. No question about that. I know England very well. I'm a member of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and you can see 180,000 people of the country from which Balfour came march on the side of Palestinians. So the march of history will continue, and I have only one thing to say: the persistence and the resilience of the Palestinians is a great force, and I'm sure they will not give up. They will not give up. This is the cardinal principle they are following on. They will not give up. I mean, just let me just say one word. The enclave of Israel among the Arab world, all history tells us that they have no long shelf life. Like Goa stayed in Indian continent for 200-300 years as Portuguese Goa. It's gone because you cannot live against history and geography. Mackay, the Chinese Mackay, was British for a long time. So is Hong Kong. But never. Also, you can also mention Algeria and French and so on. South Africa did the right thing. They bent to the storm and they adapted the storm. In Goa and in Mackay, they were extremely removed from that. So there is another case in South Africa. They bent with the waves and they wanted to live with the people. And this is what I say: there is no problem logistically, historically, geographically, even land property of Jews who want to live in peace without Zionism, without apartheid. They can live, and they did live. The question is, the motive for them to do that should be strong enough to overcome the evils they are conducting now against Palestinians. Will they do that? Will they be forced to do that? I'm sure they will be forced to do that, either on a big bang situation or slow, gradual attrition. It will happen, no question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarkable address and for your comments. Please continue doing what you're doing. We're proud of what you're doing. Keep it up. And I hope that you will join us in the future as well. Thank you, Dr. Abusaid.
Thank you for meeting all these wonderful people. Nice to see you again, Richard. Very strong.
Good to see you, Salman.
Thank you. Thank you. Last time we met in Cork, I'm sure.
Yes. That's
Yes,
right.
yes. We hope to meet again. Omar, nice to meet you. I'll send you an email. We'll be in touch. Thank you, Professor Sami. Always have been home for nice thoughts and nice people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Richard, going back to Omar's point that he was making, let's extrapolate it a bit. Let's assume that some governments actually do press the ICC and do try to institute certain policies. Where could this take us? I mean, let's say the ICC acknowledges a jurisdiction, starts working. What could happen? What could be next steps?
I think it's very difficult to anticipate in any specific detail because there are a lot of conflicting forces at work. I think the ICC has rehabilitated itself as an institution by going against geopolitics, both against the U.S. with respect to Afghanistan crimes and Israel with respect to the crimes in the occupied territories. Whether it can go further or not is problematic, I think. And whether pressure from other governments is even appropriate is also a question. It's a judicial institution. It's supposed to operate autonomously. Of course, it doesn't. There's a lot of pressure being exerted behind the scenes. And it's very hard to know how that will play out with a new prosecutor and a set of priorities by the West in Asia. See, that may relax to some degree the commitment to Israel. It's hard to know. The pattern is likely to be not very dramatic in the context of the ICC. I think one thing that could make a big difference is if the General Assembly becomes more mobilized around this issue.
But it has no teeth. The GA has no teeth.
Well, it has no teeth if powerful countries don't give it teeth. But there are countries that could make it quite effective. And a vote to impose sanctions that was overwhelming would be a very powerful symbolic step again.
Would this be voluntary, or could it be? It cannot be without the Security Council enforcing this. Because, see, I live in Turkey, and I know I'm criticizing also the situation in Turkey. Turkey has the largest trade with Israel out of all the Muslim countries. Actually, if you combine all the Muslim countries together, they will not even become half Turkey. So Turkey has its own, obviously, problems with this situation. And I'm trying to see what can be done globally speaking, where you can get, I mean, and here when you talk to the government officials, they said it's not really government policy to do this or that. It's almost private stuff, whatever it is. The question is, how can you take ideas and make them in the realm of actual policies? How can you do this? Obviously, the recommendations that Omar was suggesting, a lot of them, if they become reality, obviously it's going to have great pressure, particularly, in the war crimes arena, on the vetting of officials and so on and so forth. So my question actually to both of you actually is, how do we go from here to there? And I wanted to ask Omar also if he could respond to that question, whether the BDS tactic is also something they adopt, or and cultural and boycott and academic boycott and all that, or these are just some of the tools that civic organizations try to recommend to others. But how can we make these actually bite, not just being at the margins of the struggle? Let's start with Richard.
Well, first of all, Sami, I think one of the things that is happening is this reclaiming of the narrative, and how that translates into concrete action is something that depends on what people do. And if there's a successful mobilization of peoples around in important countries that create a global solidarity movement that exerts real pressure of an isolating kind, Israel feels the kinds of pressures that South Africa felt in the last stages of apartheid. You can't predict what that will, how that will play out as a interactive political transformation, which is quite possible. I mean, and if the youth, what Salman was saying at the end, if the Palestinian youth really challenges successfully the Palestinian Authority, which has been a very great convenience for Israel, and is a sort of a managed opposition that allows it to say that there is a kind of Palestinian voice, but it's not a voice that can lead to a sustainable peace, which requires accepting this paradigm shift that Omar's been talking about in terms of apartheid and following that with coercive measures of the sort that Human Rights Watch proposes. When that dynamic unfolds, a lot of unpredictable things will happen, and one sees this combination of global pressures and resistance on the ground as really shifting the balance of forces. You know, in many of these anti-colonial wars, that's what happened. That's what happened to the United States in the Vietnam War. It had total military superiority, yet it lost the war. And it lost the war primarily because of this mixture of legitimacy issues. It lost the people reclaimed the narrative sufficiently that the government compromised its goals sufficiently so it allowed the Vietnamese to win. See, each conflict, of course, is different, and what has to happen for the Palestinians to have the kind of leadership they need, the kind of global solidarity that would have a big impact, the undermining of the geopolitical commitment to Israel. Those are the crucial variables, in my view.
Omar?
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Falk really put it well. I think, first step in our estimation is for the world to recognize reality for what it is. As I said, sort of in my concluding remarks, you can't solve a problem that you've really misdiagnosed. And, the shift in paradigm is not just about the language we use, but it's about the core of the situation, right? I mean, there's so many elements to this that have sort of been misunderstood, right? The idea, it's not only temporary occupation, it's not only that people, when you think of a narrative around lack of a peace process, you treat human rights abuse as a symptom of the problem, as opposed to the core issue, or the idea that there's a democratic Israel that commits abuses in the occupied territory, and you don't see one underlying system, that's geared, that's, finely tuned to, benefit one people at the expense of another. But the minute you shift the paradigm, and not just shift the paradigm anywhere, but you say that there's a reality of crimes against humanity, of apartheid and persecution affecting millions of people, that's quite significant because, there's an entire apparatus. When you have a situation where you're talking about occupation, occupation is a recognized legal concept. You can commit abuses in occupation, but Human Rights Watch, for example, takes no position, on occupation, right? We document abuses by all sides in occupation. When you have it as a situation in which there's a lack of dialogue between different parties, it's easy for people to turn their brains away. But when you're talking about crimes against humanity, they're defined as such because the world came together and said, and including, why do we have apartheid as a crime? Why it wasn't just left to this experience in South Africa? It's because the world decided the practice is so odious that we should codify a body of laws that allows us to end the practice when it rears its head. And so once you've sort of gotten to the point that you're talking about crimes against humanity, there's a playbook that's followed. And that's what I think Professor Falk talks about when he says, dominoes can fall. Yes, of course, the world can ignore law. It does in a lot of cases. in the world, but it becomes much more untenable. And this is something Israeli officials have recognized, right? That when you're dealing with apartheid, when you're dealing with crimes against humanity, that's a much harder thing to turn away from. So I think once you've gotten the paradigm and narrative shift, and we're not there, I mean, it's moving, it's shifting, but we're not where we need to be. Then, of course, there's the hard work of bringing about the tools that such a situation necessitates. And that will require, a variety of different actions at different levels by different actors. Certainly the kind of joint work at the United Nations is a part of it, etc. But I just sort of wanted to make clear that we shouldn't, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, by sort of, trying to map out what, those steps are going to look like towards the end. I think right now, the necessity is, again, I look at the title of this event. I think that's sort of, reclaiming the narrative, shifting the framework, shifting the paradigm, creating the groundswell that, investigating that can lead to the sorts of measures. And it's not even so much coercive as necessitated by a situation. When you have crimes against humanity, none of us should be complicit. That's the idea that is behind, the kind of reviewing of bilateral engagement. That's what's behind, arms sales and the kind of, restrictions that would come with that. Part of it is not being complicit. Part of it is that the perpetrators who have committed crimes against humanity, crimes against all of us, should be investigated, and those who commit it should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, not just by the International Criminal Court, by courts everywhere in the world. So, that's, it's not, these wrecks aren't, wild. They're exactly what needs to happen when you have a situation of this gravity.
Well, before we go into closing statements, we have 8 minutes left, and each will get 3 at the end. But so we got a couple of minutes, and I want to hear not just what the governments or states should do, but also what the average person and activist should do. I mean, from what you're seeing now on the ground, in light of the report, in light of recognizing that Israel is an apartheid state, what do you think the average man in the street should be doing so that they can feel that they are making a difference? What should the activists be involved in? Richard.
Well, that's a difficult question, and it varies with where you are, of course, and what your background and knowledge is. But I think few are guilty, but all are responsible. And figuring out what that responsibility entails is hard to generalize. I mean, I think for many people, it is associating themselves with the BDS campaign. That's an ongoing enterprise. Acquainting themselves with these important disclosures by Human Rights Report, by B'Tselem, by others. In other words, a greater interest in seeking justice and connecting things like for Americans, the racial struggle, the Black Lives Matter, with the Palestinian struggle. I think that comes quite naturally and is quite empowering for both sides. So I think there are new possibilities for coalitions. The authenticity given to the apartheid claim by the leading moral authority figures in South Africa has always been very important for the Palestinian struggle. That Nelson Mandela said there will be no real liberation for us until the Palestinian people are free. And Bishop Tutu also has long identified with the Palestinian struggle.
That's right.
And those
I know we're at the end of the 2 minutes. I'll just say, I mean, it's I agree with Professor Falk. It really depends on the person, but I think it's important that people evaluate their own sort of affiliations, arrangements. I think the concept here is when you have crimes against humanity, no one should be complicit in them. So I think that doesn't just go on governments, that goes on companies. that operate, on the ground. And certainly that obligation would go to other actors that might engage in different ways. And so I think you can analogize the recommendations at different levels depending on, where the institution stands.
Well, since you're there, you got your 2 minutes closing statement.
Well, thank you. And thank you for everybody, particularly in the Middle East region on a Friday. That's, 10 plus past 10 p.m. that's still sort of following and listening. What I just want to say, so, beyond what we've covered here is sort of, again, I keep going back to the title of this, convening. And I think, important things are happening. Recent events show us their mobilization on the ground. Israelis and Palestinians are speaking out about what's happening. So there is a challenging. There are more and more people that are finding the courage to fight apartheid. That work needs to continue. There is an effort to reclaim the narrative, right, by different forces. Those efforts need to continue. But I do think, the last part, and this is sort of beyond even the mandate of Human Rights Watch, formulating a vision. There's so many that have written about visions and going forward. But I think that's really an important area for, a conference like this to contribute to, is to think about, what does it look like? What's, how if a universal movement rooted in human rights and justice will be the basis to end abuses, how can that translate, on the ground? And I think, when you have that as your overarching framework, and I think Professor El-Erian, you said this when you talked about the Palestinian Authority, we have to look in the mirror, Palestinians have to look in the mirror as well. We as an international community to look in the mirror. And it's very clear that the Palestinian Authority has, plays a role in the repression of Palestinians. And it's not only in the forms of security coordination that could make them complicit, in the crimes, right? It's the, arbitrary arrests, it's the torture. Hamas authorities have also, engaged in serious rights abuse on the ground. So, what is it going to take, and are we going to, be able to sort of apply these values, when it comes to the situation inside, Palestinian areas, and in terms of looking forward? I'm optimistic. Again, Dr. Abu-Sitta talked about some of the positive indications. I agree, but there are also, of course, going to be incredible pressures and otherwise. So I'll just say, thank you again to everybody for organizing this, for having this conversation. And I hope, and I look forward to other speakers who are able to help build out that last part as much of the rest of the world continues to fight, to raise their voice, challenge the paradigm, and move things forward. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Richard, 3 minutes.
Well, I would echo a lot of what Omar has just said very eloquently. It seems to me that we are at a new stage because of the documentation of the apartheid allegation. I think that's really an important development. And I would say the political message that I would hope would be very resonant with a wide circle of influential public opinion and with the media is this idea that I tried to articulate, that there is no prospect for peace without dismantling apartheid. I think that's a really strong, if you're interested in peace for the Jewish people as well as for the Palestinians, you have to be against apartheid. Mm-hmm. And building on that kind of understanding, it could restructure the whole way diplomacy is conceived in this context. And I wouldn't put it beyond the realm of possibility that the United States could rethink what it means to support Israel. And it doesn't seem plausible at the moment, but the logic is strong, and if public opinion really strengthens along these lines, along the lines that there is apartheid and that it blocks the possibility of peace, and until apartheid is eliminated from the Israel-Palestine scene, all one can hope for are a series of ceasefires. You will not get rid of Palestinian resistance. You will not get rid of Israeli repression. And I would leave it at that point, and thank you and thank everyone for a very good session.
Thank you. Thank you for both of you and for Dr. Salman for really very illuminating and thought-provoking and actually eye-opening discussion that we had today. I think it's an excellent start for our conference, and I'm very, very pleased, and I want to thank you both deeply.